Here's an article published in the Japan Academy of Physical and Biological Sciences, and it says this, quote, cholesterol is essential for the functioning of all human organs, but is nevertheless the cause of coronary heart disease. If your doctor has told you that, or if you believe that, stick around. This episode's going to rock your world. I'll give you another reason to stick around at the end of this episode. At the end, I'm going to be giving you my number one recommendation for promoting heart health. I'll give you a hint. It's not what you think. Welcome to the Natural Health Matters podcast, where it's all about maximizing your health potential so that you can look and feel your best at any age. I'm your host, David Sandstrom, naturopathic doctor and biblical health coach, and this is episode number 139. Now, this is a continuation of the Ask Me Anything series, and in the last two episodes, I answered a question from a listener by the name of Jeff, and he had a question about heart health, and we took a pretty deep dive into comparing plant-based diets with an animal-based diet and which was better. It was a great topic. I appreciate Jeff asking that question. But Jeff had a follow-up question, and that was on statin drugs. Now, I am not a medical doctor. I don't give advice on drugs or provide medical advice. Nothing I say in this podcast is intended to prevent, diagnose, treat, cure, or otherwise mitigate any disease. I'm not a medical doctor, and I don't give medical advice, but provide you with information that'll empower you to take control of your own health all day long. That's what we're doing here. So this episode is going to have a fair amount of graphics in it. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, go ahead and continue listening. But when you get home tonight, you might want to check out the video version, which you can find on YouTube at David Sandstrom Health, or my website at davidsandstrom.com/139. And you can see all the graphics that I'm using here. It will enhance your understanding of some of the concepts. So again, stick around at the end of this episode. I'm going to give you my number one recommendation for heart health. But in the meantime, let's listen to Jeff's question on statins.
Hey, David, Jeff again. Had another question for you. Really enjoy your podcast. I asked you a question before, but I wanted to ask you about your advice. I've had open heart surgery, clogging of the arteries, and basically have been on statins. I was on statins for probably 10 years before I had the open heart surgery. So just heard other things that just aren't so favorable for being on statins. I am taking the CoQ10. But what's your advice on that? And I know it's hard when the doctor is telling me to do this, but you know what? I'm just not so sure that's the route I want to take anymore. Can you help me out with this? Thanks so much.
All right, Jeff, thank you again for that question. That is a great question, one that I'm sure a lot of people have. Now, 10 years on statins and you still had heart disease anyway, I don't blame you for questioning your doctor's advice. So I would encourage you to listen to this episode, Jeff, and have that conversation with your doctor. Now, don't be surprised if he's offended, because he is a victim of a very, very sophisticated marketing campaign, just like we are. Now, most doctors don't have time to read through all the published medical literature. They might read the abstract here and there, but they don't have time to go through the whole articles, generally speaking, because they're fairly long. And doctors are busy people trying to run a business. So what they do to streamline things is they get a lot of their information from the drug rep that comes to the office. You know, if you listen to this podcast for a while, you know that I was an airline pilot for 35 years. And one day we landed in Orlando, and I was saying goodbye to the passengers like we usually do. And there was one, long-legged 20-something, 5'10" beauty queen walking off the plane after the other. And I said to the male flight attendant, I said, is there a beauty pageant in town? There's a lot of really beautiful women getting off this plane. He said, no, it's not a beauty pageant, Dave. These are pharmaceutical reps. They're here for a convention. So that's the army that the pharmaceutical companies send out to promote their products. It's very well funded and a very sophisticated form of marketing. Now, we'll be talking about the marketing of these pharmaceuticals in a little bit, but first I want to dive into what cholesterol actually does. Now, cholesterol is not the enemy that we've been led to believe. It is a very important part of our physiology. Cholesterol is involved in making and repairing new cells. It stabilizes the cell membrane. Now, years ago, they used to think that the brain behind a cell was the nucleus, but that's not true. The brain of a cell, the real brain, is the cell membrane. It's that outer layer that separates the inside of the cell with the extracellular fluid that's outside the cell. And what the cell membrane does is it's made up of phospholipids, and it has gates and channels. And those gates will keep toxins and unwanted compounds out of the cell, and the channels allow nutrients and other molecules inside the cell. And that is an important function of the cell membrane, and cholesterol is intimately involved with creating the proper rigidity and the fluidity of the cell membrane. There's a delicate balance there, and cholesterol is involved in doing that. It's a very important part of the functioning of a cell membrane, which is the brain behind our cells. So every one of our 75 trillion cells needs to have that delicate balance going on in the cell membrane. And cholesterol is involved in that. Cholesterol is also involved in repairing nerves. It improves memory. A lot of people don't know this, but cholesterol is really, the brain is very, very dependent upon cholesterol. 25% of the cholesterol in our bodies resides in the brain. And there was a study published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, and they said this: lowering cholesterol levels may impair brain function since cholesterol is essential for synapse formation and maturation and plays an important role in the regulation of signal transduction through its function as a component of cell membrane. So there we go. Because of that role that cholesterol plays in the functioning of the cell membrane, it enhances brain function by enhancing neurons to fire and nervous system transmission. It's really an incredibly important function. Cholesterol is also involved in the synthesizing of important hormones like testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, DHEA, progesterone. All of these important hormones start life as cholesterol in the body through a series of enzymatic and biochemical reactions, converts that cholesterol into those important hormones. So without cholesterol, our hormone balance will be out of whack. Cholesterol is also involved in vitamin D production. Cholesterol on the skin, called 7-hydroxycholesterol, converts sunlight into vitamin D. Cholesterol is a crucial part of that process. It's also involved in boosting serotonin levels, our happy hormone of serotonin. It's also involved in the manufacture of bile, which is important for digestion of fat. Cholesterol also functions as an important antioxidant in the body, and it's involved in the proper function of our immune system. So there's a lot of important, crucial functions to cholesterol. And just blanketly lowering cholesterol, like many doctors want to do, is perhaps not the best advice out there. Now, I chose the opening statement in this episode because it's pretty typical of what is the consensus out there in the scientific and the medical community on that article that was published in the Japan Academy of Physical and Biological Sciences. I'll repeat it here. Cholesterol is essential for the functioning of all human organs. That part is correct. But it nevertheless is the cause of heart disease. Well, I would challenge that notion. That's what we're going to talk about this episode. So why would something so important to our physiology be responsible for heart disease? Did God make a mistake? Did God not anticipate that cholesterol could be part of plaque accumulation in the arteries? I don't think so. I don't think that when the first human being had a heart attack, God didn't say, didn't see that one coming. No, that's not what happened. God gave our bodies the ability to manufacture cholesterol for a reason, because we need it. Now, arterial plaque is made up of calcium, fat, cellular waste, fibrin, which is a substance that our body uses to promote blood clotting, and cholesterol. So why do we single out LDL cholesterol as the villain or the bad guy? Well, that's because we have a drug that lowers it. Now, again, more on marketing in a little bit. Statins do effectively lower cholesterol. They do it by blocking an enzyme called HMG coenzyme A. And that enzyme is intimately involved in a series of biochemical reactions in the manufacture of cholesterol. And statins do work. They will lower your LDL cholesterol if you take them. But that lowering of cholesterol comes at a cost. And we call that cost side effects. Now, the pharmaceutical companies want us to believe that these side effects are minimal, but they're not. They include muscle pain. Now, it's pretty well known that one of the best things you can do for heart health is to exercise. So if you were a doctor, why would you prescribe a medication that causes muscle pain and joint pain that would decrease someone's likelihood to exercise? That's what statins do. They also contribute to high blood sugar that could eventually lead to type 2 diabetes. Now, the FDA considers that such a strong risk that they require a label on the packaging of a statin package that says that using this product could increase blood sugar, cause insulin resistance, and lead to type 2 diabetes. That's a pretty strong statement from the FDA itself. Here's an article I found on the CDC website itself. It's entitled Statins and Diabetes, What You Should Know. They said, quote, some research has found that using statins increases blood sugar because statin use can stop your body's insulin from doing its job properly. This can put people who use statins at higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. That's from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, folks. This is not some natural health tree hugger website. That's from the CDC themselves. Statins can cause liver damage. They can cause digestive difficulty by impeding bile production, as we just talked about. They can compromise the immune. Here's an article entitled Immunosuppression, a Role for Statins. And they say in that article, quote, another class of drugs that demonstrates immunosuppressive activity includes statins, end quote. Now, this article goes on to discuss the role that statin administration can have on suppressing immune function in organ transplant patients. So that's a pretty broad statement. Say, if you have an organ transplant, your body can recognize that organ as a foreign entity and attack it. They call that rejecting that new organ. So in order to prevent that from happening, they have to put you on immunosuppressant drugs for the rest of your life if you're an organ transplant patient. And this article is saying that, one of the ways we can effectively lower someone's immune function and prevent rejection of the new organ is by putting them on statins. Another issue that statins have is cognitive issues, leading to memory loss and possibly dementia. Again, so much so that the FDA requires a warning label on the packaging about cognitive issues or cognitive decline with statins. Here's another article I found. It's entitled Statins, a Case for Drug Withdrawal in Patients with Dementia. So take a look at this chart here. On the y-axis are the mental cognition scores of people with dementia on statins. And on the x-axis is time. In this case, this chart is in 2 weeks. So in a 2-week time frame, all but one of these study participants improved their mental cognition by getting off of statins. Here's what these researchers found. Quote, there is accumulating evidence suggesting that statins may be associated with worsening cognition. One study reported 60 cases of memory loss associated with statins. Approximately half of those patients reported adverse effects on cognition within 2 months of statin use, and 56% noted improvement upon their discontinuation. Memory loss recurred in 4 subjects upon re-challenge with statins. Translation: these dementia patients that were on statins got off statins and saw their mental cognition scores dramatically improve. Then when they got back on statins, their cognition declined once again. Now that's a pretty important finding. And they concluded their statements with this. In a survey, 90% of people reported improvement in memory after discontinuation of statins. So drug companies call all these effects rare and minimal. Would you call high blood sugar and insulin sensitivity that can lead to type 2 diabetes minimal? So much so that it requires a warning label by the FDA? Would you call cognitive issues that can lead to dementia so much so that, again, requiring a warning label by the FDA? Would you call that minimal? I wouldn't. I'd call that pretty significant. So how is it that drugs with all these side effects have really become the darling of the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry? Well, The pharmaceutical industry has experienced a boom in the last couple of decades. Look at this chart here. In 2001, worldwide pharmaceutical sales were $390 billion. And in 2023, $1.6 trillion. Now that is blockbuster growth. And that comes from a few all-star drugs that really move the needle for the pharmaceutical industry. And of those all-star drugs, Lipitor is king. Lipitor is the most popular drug ever sold. It's a statin, it lowers cholesterol, and it's the GOAT of the pharmaceutical industry. It's the greatest drug of all time. 47 million people in the United States are on statins, and Lipitor, the number one selling drug of all time, from 1992 to 2017, that was 5 years ago, Lipitor's gross revenues were $95 billion. Now, I'm sure it's well in excess of $100 billion right now. I would call that 100 billion reasons to lie about cholesterol. Here's an article on Yahoo Finance that projected annual revenues for statin drugs to rise to $22 billion by the year 2032. Now, this article goes on to celebrate the idea that type 2 diabetes and obesity will pave the way for substantial growth in the statin industry. Now, that kind of explosive growth doesn't happen by accident. There's intentional effort behind it, and there's creative and effective marketing. Now, if drugs treat disease, and most people with a disease are already on drugs, how do you increase your market? How do you grow your market dramatically, as such as the industry has done? Well, you expand the definition of disease. That way you can put more people on your products. Now, when it comes to statins, they've taken a risk factor for disease and called it a disease. So this is a really interesting article I found. It's talking about a guy by the name of Henry Gadsden. He was the CEO of Merck, and he retired in 1976. And he did a candid interview as he was approaching retirement in Fortune magazine. And in that conversation, he was talking about how his company had done a great job of marketing their products to sick people. But he would have preferred that Merck be more like Wrigley's chewing gum. That way they could, quote, sell to everyone. You see, it had long been his dream to make drugs for healthy people. Now, his dream has since come true. In 1986, 10 years after Henry Gadsden retired, Merck got FDA approval for lovastatin, the first commercial statin drug to be approved by the FDA. Now, Lipitor came along 9 years later in 1996. Now, Lipitor went on to surpass lovastatin and become the best-selling drug of all time. But lovastatin was already a well-established and popular drug at that point. How'd Pfizer do that? Pfizer is the owner of Lipitor. How'd they accomplish that? Well, they were helped out by the FDA's relaxation of advertising restrictions for television ads for pharmaceutical drugs. That happened in 1999. So with deep pockets and a large marketing budget, pharmaceutical companies went after consumers, and consumers were easy targets. So here's what they used for a formula. Scare people, offer them a solution to mitigate their fears, and that equals success in the marketplace. Now, the lipid hypothesis fits right into this marketing scheme. They say this: when you eat saturated fat, it raises your LDL cholesterol. High LDL cholesterol causes atherosclerotic plaque to accumulate in your arteries, which leads to heart disease. If you don't want to die young, get on our drugs and stay on them for the rest of your life. That's the way they market these statin drugs. And as we just saw, their marketing scheme has been very, very effective. So it's not difficult to see how pharmaceutical companies can convince consumers that they need these drugs. But their marketing doesn't end there. It's multi-layered. And they go after doctors and medical professionals as well with their marketing. Now, we said earlier that doctors are busy people. They're running their business. They're trying to make a living. They're trying to help people. So how do they fool doctors who have a lot of education into putting people on these drugs? Well, one of the ways is they rig the clinical trial. When pharmaceutical companies want to get a drug FDA approved, they stack the deck in their favor. It's kind of like a casino. when you go into a casino, you know that the game is rigged. If you play their game long enough, you're going to lose. The house is going to win. And everybody knows it going in. Okay, the game is rigged in a casino. Well, the pharmaceutical industry has taken a few lessons from the casino gambling industry, and they've stacked the deck in their favor with their clinical trials. Here's how they do it. Prior to the start of a clinical trial, they take volunteers, people that have agreed to participate in the trial, and they actually give them the drug in question. And this lasts for a few weeks, several weeks. And people that have an adverse reaction to the drug during the on-ramping time frame, they're dismissed from the trial. They're not included in the trial. And some people during that on-ramping period experience some detrimental effects from the drug, and they just quit. So as a result, pharmaceutical companies can dramatically reduce the amount of side effects that they're required to report to the FDA from their clinical trial. It's deception. All right? And here's the biggest one. Here's the kicker. And when I said earlier that they had 100 billion reasons to lie about cholesterol, this is what I was referring to. Now, I have an MBA, and in my business program, we study statistics, and we used statistical data to create models to make predictions in various markets and business. And I had an instructor at my college, and he used to say this a lot: figures lie and liars figure. And that's what the pharmaceutical industry is doing right now. They're messing with these figures. They're using statistical manipulation to deceive people. So let me give you for instance. Now, this is very, very common in the industry, but I chose this study here because it's pretty representative of what goes on. It's called the LRC-CPPT, and it stands for Lipid Research Clinics Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. Now, I chose this trial because this is one of the foundational studies that policymakers refer to when they form their consensus statements. And it's had a lot of praise from other medical journals. For instance, the British Medical Journal said this about this study, quote, "At long last, we have clear evidence that reducing very high plasma concentrations of cholesterol and low-density lipoprotein, LDL cholesterol, lowers the incidence of coronary heart disease," end quote. Now, here's another commentary on this study published in Australia, around the globe. It's entitled, "The Lipid Hypothesis is Proven." Now, inside of this commentary article, they declared, "The incidence of death from definite coronary heart disease was reduced by 24% in the cholestyramine group." So they concluded, quote, "The LRC-CPPT has given a new respectability and credibility to the dietary and pharmacological management of hypercholesterolemia." All right, so at long last, we've got what we wanted. It's been difficult to prove that statins are useful, but they cite this trial to say, yeah, we finally found what we've been looking for. And they use words like clear evidence, proof, respectable, and credible. So let me give you, let's break down the data that they call clear, respectable evidence. Take a look at this chart. It's from the LPC-CPPT study. And this chart represents people that didn't die from heart disease. Now, this study lasted 7.5 years, and they had about 3,800 people, and they split them up into two groups. 1,900 people, 1,900 got the placebo, and 1,908 got the statin drug, which is, in this case, cholestyramine. Now, out of these two groups, the placebo group, in the 7.5-year follow-up time frame, 38 people died from heart disease. That is 2% of that group. And in the statin group, 30 people died, and that represents 1.6% of that population. So that's an absolute risk reduction of 0.4% of risk improvement. In other words, people taking the statin did 0.4% better than people taking the placebo. Now, these study results are claiming a 24% risk reduction in heart disease risk. How can they do that with only a 0.4% improvement? Well, here's how they do it. They use relative risk reduction instead of absolute risk reduction. They take the 0.4%, the actual benefit that the statin group received, and divide that by 2%, or the absolute number of deaths from the placebo group, and they come up with 24% improvement. Now, when I divide 0.4 by 2, I come up with 20%. But nevertheless, they found a way to manipulate this data even further and come up with 24%. So that's what they publish, and that's what this study is promoted as proving, is that there is a 24% reduction in heart disease risk by getting on cholestyramine. And that's what's accepted as proof when it comes to statin drugs. Now, when it comes to side effects observed during the clinical trial, I remember they took steps to reduce that, right? But then they choose to use the absolute risk analysis when it comes to side effects, which makes the side effects appear far less likely. So that's how they get people with a medical education to support the use of statin drugs. If they didn't, doctors would have far less support for statins, and patients' willingness to take statins would basically fall off the cliff. Take a look at this chart here. This chart shows that when stated as a relative risk reduction, the benefits of statin drugs, 77% of physicians and 88% of patients are willing to prescribe or take that drug. When stated as an absolute risk reduction, only 24% of physicians would be willing to prescribe statins, and only 42% of patients would be willing to take it. Now, that would dramatically reduce the effectiveness of their marketing, would it not? So that's why they deceive people, and that's how they do it. If you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, when you get home tonight, I encourage you to watch the video version. These charts will really enhance your understanding of what's going on here. I want to say thank you to Dr. David Diamond. He's the LDL skeptic on X or Twitter, and he's the one that compiled this information and created these charts for us. So you might be saying right about now, all right, Dave, okay, we've been misled, maybe even lied to, but if LDL cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease, what does? Well, that's a good question. LDL in and of itself doesn't spontaneously convert to plaque inside our arteries. That's not the way it works. The real cause of atherosclerosis, are you ready for this? It's damage to the endothelial lining in the arteries. The endothelial lining is the inside of the artery. Now, I want to play a video for you. I got this video off of the Cleveland Clinic website, and it's very insightful. So let's listen and watch this video together.
Atherosclerosis is the most important and most common type of arteriosclerosis, a group of diseases in which the wall of an artery becomes thicker and less elastic. The development of atherosclerosis is complex, but the primary event appears to be injury to the arterial wall. Many different factors can injure the artery's wall, triggering the formation of plaque, for example, turbulent blood flow due to high blood pressure, BP, inflammatory immune responses, certain infections, and chemical abnormalities of the blood, such as diabetes and high cholesterol. Chemical signals that are generated as a result of injury cause white blood cells to attach to the arterial wall, where they collect cholesterol and other fatty materials, eventually forming plaque. Over time, the buildup of plaque narrows the space within an artery.
Okay, so in that video, again, put together by a very well-respected heart health hospital, they say the primary event appears to be injury to the arterial wall. Then they go on to say high blood pressure, inflammation, infections, diabetes, and high cholesterol all contribute to that. I would add to that high triglycerides, obesity, insulin resistance, sedentary lifestyle, smoking, chemical toxins, and anger and hostility. So there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of layers to what causes heart disease. To break it down to say, well, the only thing that causes heart disease is excessive LDL cholesterol, and you need to get on this statin. To bring it down to that is, again, another glaring example of scientific reductionism. It's just not that simple, is it? As I hope you're beginning to see by now. So what is the mechanism? how does plaque start to form in the arteries? I think it's important to understand the mechanism behind it. So there's something called a shear rate. And shear rate is the friction or the resistance that's built up by the blood flowing inside the artery wall. Now, because of many of the reasons that we just cited, blood can act like sandpaper, wearing out the endothelial lining in certain spots of the artery, especially where blood flow is turbulent. Now, in a healthy person, your blood is thin and slippery, and therefore you have a very low shear rate. But in an unhealthy person, the blood gets thicker, and the blood cells become more abrasive, and the shear rate goes up, and the friction increases. And over time, that's what causes damage to the endothelial lining of the inside of the artery. So what's the body supposed to do with that damage? Repair it. Remember, cholesterol is a cellular repair protein. We talked about that at the top of the episode. Now, groups of cells make tissues. Groups of tissues make organs. Groups of organs make systems. Groups of systems make up the body. But it all starts at the cellular level. Now, wouldn't it make sense that damaged tissue that's in need of repair, that's made of cells, could become a collection site for a cellular repair protein? That cellular repair protein is called cholesterol, which is primarily made in the liver and is delivered to the site that needs it by riding on a molecule called LDL, or low-density lipoprotein. LDL is not cholesterol. LDL is a lipoprotein molecule, and that molecule acts like a taxi cab for cholesterol. It carries cholesterol from the liver to the site in the body where it's needed. Now, if the damaged artery is not repaired, the wall of the artery would eventually rupture, and we call that type of rupture an aneurysm, and it's very dangerous and quite often fatal. So LDL cholesterol is part of the patch the body uses to repair the damage to the artery. So the patch is not as good as the original. Now, our bodies are programmed for survival, and the plaque that is found on the endothelial lining of a atherosclerotic artery is the body's way of keeping us alive. The body does the best it can with a less than ideal situation. Now, again, the problem is the repair is not as good as the original. If you had a severe laceration to your skin on the outside of the body would heal, that skin would heal, but you may end up with a scar. Now, something similar is going on inside the artery. Now, here's another important point that I want to emphasize. Atherosclerosis, or plaque accumulation, only occurs in arteries. It doesn't occur in veins. So, a quick anatomy lesson here. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. Now, it's the same blood running through both types of pipes, right? It's the same blood with all the same ingredients in it that's running through both arteries and veins at any given moment. If LDL alone were the cause of atherosclerosis, if the simple presence of high amounts of LDL were the only reason we experience plaque buildup, why don't human beings get atherosclerotic buildup in their veins? We don't. That never happens. Unless if someone has bypass surgery and the surgeon harvests a vein from one part of the body and replaces a damaged artery with that vein, we can now see plaque buildup in that vein/artery after bypass surgery. But barring that, that never happens in nature. We don't see plaque buildup in veins. Even people with a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a genetic condition that causes sky-high levels of LDL cholesterol, we don't see plaque buildup in their veins. If high LDL cholesterol were the only variable, that wouldn't be the case. There's obviously something more going on here than just high cholesterol. In my opinion, atherosclerosis is caused by damage to the endothelial lining of the artery caused by high shear rates in the presence of oxidized cholesterol that interferes with the efficient repair of that damaged artery. Again, I believe that our bodies are created with divine design, And God has placed inside of us a built-in intelligence. That intelligence knows what it's doing, and it's doing the best job it can to keep us alive with a less than ideal environment. Now, I said this earlier, the liver is the manufacturing plant for cholesterol. When cholesterol leaves the factory, it's like a new car leaving the assembly line. It's all shiny and new. Cholesterol, when it leaves the liver, is large, light, and fluffy. When cholesterol is damaged by oxidation, it becomes small and dense, and therefore more likely to contribute to atherosclerotic plaque. The oxidized, small, dense LDL cholesterol is less efficient at repairing damage to the endothelial lining of the arteries. So how does LDL become oxidized? Well, there's a number of reasons, but I believe it's primarily due to the overconsumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids that are abundant in seed oils. Now, on the next episode, I'm going to be talking about saturated fat and seed oils. Don't have time to go into all that right here. Be sure to check that episode out. It's going to be episode number 140. But for now, trust me when I tell you that the overconsumption of polyunsaturated fat in the form of linoleic acid from seed oils is largely responsible for many chronic conditions, including heart disease. And I'm going to give you a boatload of evidence in the next episode, so stick around for that one. So if plaque buildup is multifaceted, why do we blame cholesterol alone? You know, if you had a hole in your wall and I patched it with some plaster, would we blame the plaster for the hole? Of course not. Do we blame the fireman for the fire? Like if we blame LDL cholesterol, which is a cellular repair protein, for the reason why plaque builds up in the arteries, it's like blaming the firemen for the fire. They didn't cause it. The firemen are there to clean up the mess. The same is true with LDL cholesterol. But the primary event is damage to the endothelial lining, like we heard in that video from the Cleveland Clinic. Now, why do I want you to understand all this? It's because of this. Elevated LDL cholesterol in a metabolically healthy person is nothing to fear. I'm going to say that again. Elevated LDL cholesterol in a metabolically healthy person is nothing to fear. So you might be asking, what does a metabolically healthy person look like? Well, that's a good question. And I think there are some basic labs that we can run to determine your metabolic fitness. Of course, one would be very simple, a normal blood pressure. You want your blood pressure to be lower than 120 over 80. You want your fasting insulin to be somewhere between 5 and 10. That's an excellent measure of your metabolic fitness or your metabolic health. You want your fasting glucose below 90. You want your hemoglobin A1C below 5.7. You'd like to see your body mass index, which is kind of a rough estimate of how much body fat you're carrying, somewhere between 20 and 25, something like that. Another good test to run to see how metabolically fit you are is HSCRP, which stands for high sensitivity C-reactive protein. You want that number to be less than 2. Another very important marker is your triglyceride to HDL ratio. You'd like to see that to be around 1:1. If your triglycerides are too high, you need to cut back on your sugar intake, which is a good idea for anyone, right? And if your HDL is too low, increase your physical activity. You should be shooting for a triglyceride to HDL ratio of about 1:1, something like that. Now, if heart disease runs in your family and you're really concerned, you want to know where you stand, your risk factor for heart disease, a good test to run would be a CAC, coronary artery calcium scan. You're looking for a score of 0, which would be no plaque buildup in the arteries. Also, a similar scan is a CTA, or computed tomography angiography. That is a similar scan to the CAC, but they also use a dye to help them look for the plaque. Now, if you're going to do either one of those scans, I highly recommend you ask them how much radiation their CT scanner has. The older machines have far more ionizing radiation exposure than the newer digital machines. So make sure you go to a facility that has one of the newer, more modern digital CT scanners that has lower levels of ionizing radiation. The new machines have about 1/5 the amount of ionizing radiation in a CT scan. So if you're not metabolically healthy, start making some lifestyle choices, lifestyle changes that can get you healthy. What do those include? Well, first and foremost, don't smoke, vape, chew tobacco. That's well known. Don't abuse alcohol. Get away from processed foods, especially refined sugar, especially in the form of a high fructose corn syrup. Very, very bad for our health. Getting away from processed foods will also help you lower or even eliminate seed oils. Seed oils are found in fried foods at restaurants. You want to cut out, one of the healthiest things you can do is just avoid fried food at a restaurant altogether. It's almost certainly fried in high temperature. Seed oils are very toxic to the body. Get good rest, manage your emotions, work on good, solid, connected relationships. Those will all be health promoting. Now, we've talked a lot about what happens physically to our bodies and the mechanism behind atherosclerosis. But I wrote a book on holistic health. It's called The Christian's Guide to Holistic Health. So I always recommend going beyond the physical alone. Now, if this message is resonating with you, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of my book. It's called The Christian's Guide to Holistic Health. It's available on Amazon in 4 different formats: paperback, hardcover, Kindle, and Audible. Now, as promised, I want to give you my top recommendation for promoting heart health. Here it is. Don't get too myopic and totally caught up on the physical only. We need to consider our spiritual and mental emotional state as well. The Bible in Proverbs 23:7 says this, "For as a man thinks in his heart, so is he." So the thoughts and the emotions that we experience are intricately connected to our physical outcomes. Now, it's always good when I see ancient wisdom from the Bible that has been confirmed with modern scientific proof. So here's a study that I found published in the Journal of Psychological Sciences entitled "Psychological Language on Twitter Predicts County-Level Heart Disease Mortality." And here's what they had to say. A cross-sectional regression model based only on Twitter language predicted actual heart disease mortality significantly better than did a model that combined 10 common demographic, socioeconomic, and health risk factors, including smoking, diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. I want you to take a look at a couple of the charts that they included in this study. Now, here is some word clouds that depict the words that they looked for on Twitter. I'm not going to use the exact words because it's really foul language here, folks, but one of the categories was hostility and aggression. Another one was hate and interpersonal tension. And another category that contributed to heart disease was boredom and fatigue. Now, the words that they looked for that enhanced heart disease or was positively associated with heart disease prevention were skilled occupations, positive experiences, and optimism. All right? And here is the predicted results versus these other traditional lifestyle factors that would normally use to predict heart disease rates, like smoking, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, gender, ethnicity, married or single. Those are all good measures to predict heart disease rates. But if you combine all of those together, this Twitter prediction model was more effective at predicting actual heart disease rates that were found in the actual CDC data. Take a look at this chart here. All right, this is a map of counties in the northeastern United States showing age-adjusted mortality from atherosclerotic heart disease, AHD, as reported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So the CDC data is on the left, and the Twitter prediction data is on the right. And if you're listening to the audio version, folks, the similarity here is striking. It's amazing how accurate their predictions were. And what they did is they analyzed anger and hostility and compared that with things like optimism and loneliness and relational connection. And they're able to very, very accurately predict where heart disease rates would be higher or lower. It's really quite startling. So again, it warms my heart to see modern science catching up with what the Bible is promoting for thousands of years. Ephesians 4:26 says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. And Philippians 4:8 says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, pure, lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence or anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. Now, God doesn't say dwell on these things because if you don't, it could contribute to the shear rate inside your arteries and cause atherosclerotic plaque that could lead to heart disease. He just says, I love you. Do it my way. You won't be sorry. So that's my number one recommendation for promoting heart health. Take inventory of your thought life. Don't be an angry person. Don't hold on to hostility, and work on your relationships. I guess that's more than one, but letting go of anger and working on relationships kind of go hand in hand, right? They're kind of two sides of the same coin. So if you do that, you'll be going a long way towards promoting heart health. So there's my take on cholesterol and statins. Make sure you check out the next episode on saturated fat and seed oils. That information is going to blow you away, folks. I'm telling you, it's going to be earth-shattering. If you're getting value from this podcast, would you tell a friend about it? The number one way people find out about a podcast is someone tells them about it. And health and wellness from a biblical perspective in the natural health world is kind of hard to come by. So if you're getting value out of here, you may have a friend that would very much appreciate you sharing this podcast with them. You can also leave me an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That helps get the word out as well. Again, check out my book, The Christian's Guide to Holistic Health. It's available in paperback, hardcover, Kindle, and Audible on Amazon. That's it for now. I enjoyed serving you. Thank you for listening. I'll talk with you next time. Be blessed.